Miguel Hernandez surveyed the luxurious Hotel Emperador in the heart of Madrid with a complex mix of professional determination and personal curiosity about how he would be received at this five-star establishment that boasted of serving exclusively Spain's business and aristocratic elite. His threadbare work clothes and battered backpack contrasting dramatically with the Italian marbles, Bohemian crystals, and Persian rugs adorning the lobby where wealthy tourists and executives in designer suits circulated with the casual confidence characteristic of those who had never experienced economic exclusion or class discrimination. The polished bronze revolving doors reflected his image as he entered, reminding him of the visual disparity between his modest appearance and the ambience of calculated opulence that the hotel's designers had meticulously created to communicate exclusivity and social status to clients willing to pay premium prices in association with ostentatious luxury. "Good afternoon, I need to reserve a room for tonight," he said as he approached the elaborately carved mahogany reception desk where receptionist Carlos Mendoza looked up from his computer, his expression quickly shifting from automatic professional courtesy to barely concealed skepticism as he assessed the appearance of the man who dared request accommodations at a hotel that charged more per night than many Spaniards earned in an honest week's work. The awkward pause before the receptionist's reply communicated volumes about the assumptions he was making based solely on superficial cues of socioeconomic class that modern Spanish society had learned to read with unsettling accuracy despite the egalitarian rhetoric that persisted in political and cultural discourse. Miguel had experienced this particular moment of discriminatory evaluation dozens of times during his two-decade career building a hotel empire from humble beginnings as a bellboy in a budget hotel in Barcelona, and he recognized the micro-gestures of disdain that inevitably preceded some form of veiled rejection or differential treatment designed to discourage guests deemed inappropriate for establishments that marketed exclusivity as their primary product. Experiential knowledge of these power and class dynamics did nothing to lessen the emotional sting of being judged inferior by strangers who knew nothing about his history, character, or financial capabilities beyond what his attire communicated about his perceived position in arbitrary social hierarchies. Nevertheless, he maintained a neutral expression and relaxed posture that reflected both professional self-control developed over years in the service industry and a personal determination not to allow outside prejudices to dictate his behavior or erode his fundamental dignity as a human being deserving of basic courtesy regardless of his bank account or wardrobe. The growing tension in the prolonged silence as the receptionist seemingly searched for diplomatic words to communicate that Miguel did not belong in this luxurious space created an observable atmosphere that began to attract curious glances from other guests and staff in the elegant lobby. "Sir, this is an internationally recognized five-star hotel," Carlos finally replied, his tone intended to sound helpful but clearly conveying patronizing condescension designed to manage the expectations of someone who obviously didn't understand what kind of establishment he'd wandered into through mistake or misinformation. "And our rates reflect the premium level of service and accommodations we provide to our distinguished clientele, starting at €400 per night for our most basic room, which frankly may significantly exceed the budget you've allocated for accommodations during your visit to Madrid." The explicit reference to presumed financial constraints crossed a line of professional courtesy into the territory of thinly veiled insult that revealed institutional training on how to discreetly discourage clients deemed inappropriate without creating public scenes that could damage the hotel's reputation or generate formal complaints to regulatory authorities or industry associations. Miguel immediately recognized this tactic as a variation on countless strategies that upscale establishments employed to maintain demographic homogeneity among their clientele without explicitly violating anti-discrimination laws that technically prohibited denial of service based on social class or personal appearance. "I fully understand your rates and am prepared to pay whatever is necessary for appropriate accommodations," Miguel responded with a patience that suggested familiarity with this type of discriminatory interaction. "So I would appreciate it if you could show me available options for this evening without continuing to make assumptions about my financial situation based solely on how I am currently dressed after a long and tiring trip." His courteous yet firm response directly challenged the receptionist's assumptions while establishing boundaries regarding acceptable treatment, communicating that he would not be easily intimidated into abandoning his legitimate request for service, which the hotel publicly offered to any guest able to pay the stated rates. The calm yet authoritative tone of his voice caught the attention of manager Roberto Salazar, who had been observing the interaction from his office, whose glass windows allowed him to monitor lobby activities while maintaining the illusion of executive privacy that his hierarchical position supposedly merited. Roberto had built a reputation in Madrid's hotel industry as a relentless guardian of exclusivity standards that justified the Hotel Emperador's premium prices, developing a self-proclaimed, almost infallible instinct for identifying individuals who didn't fit with the establishment's carefully cultivated brand image. Miguel's presence in the lobby represented exactly the type of situation Roberto considered his managerial specialty, diplomatically removing inappropriate individuals before their presence contaminated the luxurious ambience that guests paid generously to experience unintruded by the broader socio-economic realities of contemporary Spain. "Carlos, is there a problem here?" Roberto intervened as he approached the reception desk with a confident stride and an expression of professional authority he had honed over 20 years climbing the managerial ladder of progressively more exclusive establishments, his €3,000 Armani suit and Rolex watch visually communicating the level of sophistication and success he expected from anyone who shared the spaces he managed. "Because I observe that the conversation with this gentleman is running on in a manner that suggests some confusion about our policies or capabilities that requires managerial clarification." His characterization of the interaction as confusion, rather than obvious discrimination, reflected his linguistic skill in framing problematic situations in ways that protected the hotel from liability while keeping options open for escalating exclusionary treatment if potential guests didn't pick up on subtle hints about their lack of belonging. Carlos turned to his supervisor with evident relief at being able to transfer responsibility for the awkward situation to someone with greater institutional authority and experience handling potential conflicts with tact that minimized the risk of formal complaints or negative media attention. "This gentleman is inquiring about room availability for tonight," Carlos explained, his tone implying skepticism about the legitimacy of the inquiry without explicitly stating doubts that could be documented as a legal discrimination. "And I have attempted to ensure that you fully understand our price level and the type of hotel experience we offer our regular clientele before proceeding with a reservation, which could result in mutual dissatisfaction if expectations are not properly aligned." The corporate verbiage deliberately obscured the underlying message about Miguel's perceived unsuitability as an appropriate guest for the Hotel Emperador, employing customer expectation management language that sounded professional but served the primary function of protecting the hotel against accusations of discriminatory treatment. Roberto sized Miguel up with a glance that ranged from his unkempt hair to his worn work boots, mentally cataloging every element of his appearance that violated unwritten codes of appropriate presentation for guests of truly luxury establishments, based on his standards internalized over decades in an image and exclusivity-obsessed industry. "Let me be very direct to avoid any misunderstandings." Roberto directed his full attention to Miguel, his expression blending paternalistic condescension with an authoritarian firmness that would brook no debate about his professional conclusions. "The Hotel Emperador is neither a youth hostel nor a budget hostel where backpackers can show up expecting to find an available bed at an affordable price, but a five-star establishment catering primarily to corporate executives, diplomats, and high-net-worth tourists who value a certain level of refinement in their lodging environment." The calculated pause before refinement communicated with devastating accuracy his assessment that Miguel lacked the qualities necessary to fit comfortably among typical hotel guests without creating dissonance that might diminish the experience of other, more commercially valuable clients. The barely contained arrogance in his presentation reflected absolute confidence that his assessment was correct and that any resistance from Miguel would simply confirm his fundamental unsuitability for the elite spaces that Roberto jealously protected against intrusions from lower social classes. "I'm not looking for discounts or special treatment," Miguel responded, maintaining admirable composure in the face of increasingly obvious insults that violated basic principles of professional hospitality that supposedly defined the luxury service industry. "I simply want to reserve a room for one night and am completely willing to pay the full established rate for any accommodation you deem appropriate. So I would appreciate it if you could process my request professionally rather than continuing to make judgments about my financial situation or suitability as a guest based on assumptions that have no factual basis." His calm but unequivocal insistence on professional service nonetheless directly challenged the discriminatory treatment while establishing that he would not be intimidated into abandoning his legitimate request by the social awkwardness or psychological pressure that Roberto was applying with increasing obviousness. The firmness of his response surprised Roberto, who rarely encountered significant resistance when employing his proven techniques of polite dissuasion, which typically convinced inappropriate guests to seek accommodations elsewhere without an explicit rejection that could generate legal or public relations problems. "Very well, sir," Roberto replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and clearly communicated that he was about to enjoy what he anticipated would be the inevitable humiliation of someone who had dared to challenge his authority and professional judgment about who deserved access to the exclusive spaces he managed. "We have precisely one room available tonight, our smallest room, located in the basement near the service areas, with no view and minimal amenities, which we are offering at €400 a night as our most economical option." The deliberately unappealing room description was designed to discourage bookings while technically complying with Miguel's request to be shown available options without explicit discrimination that could be documented as a violation of regulations. Roberto paused dramatically, allowing the room's unappealing specifications to sink in before continuing with what he clearly considered the masterstroke of his strategy of public humiliation. "However," he added in a tone of exaggerated condescension that attracted the attention of other guests and staff in the lobby, "if you successfully manage to pay for that basic basement room without your credit card being declined for insufficient funds, as I sincerely anticipate will be the case, I will be so impressed by my error of judgment that I will personally upgrade you to our presidential suite valued at €2,000 per night at absolutely no additional charge." His public gamble was carefully designed to achieve multiple objectives simultaneously: to humiliate Miguel in front of an audience of witnesses, to demonstrate to staff and guests his superior ability to identify financial imposters, and to create a situation where Miguel's voluntary retirement would seem preferable to the anticipated embarrassment of a declined card in front of curious onlookers. The absolute confidence in his voice reflected unwavering certainty that a man with such unimpressive appearance could not possibly possess the financial resources necessary to afford even the most modest room in his genuinely luxurious establishment. The expectant silence that fell over the lobby as staff and guests watched the increasingly obvious confrontation created an atmosphere of anticipatory drama that Roberto clearly enjoyed as validation of his institutional power and superior judgment regarding the appropriate social categorization of individuals according to superficial signs of wealth and status. "Are you making that offer officially and binding?" Miguel asked with a calmness that completely concealed the inner satisfaction he felt watching the arrogant manager construct an elaborate trap for himself based on prejudiced assumptions that would soon be demolished in a spectacular and publicly humiliating manner. "Because if you are proposing specific contractual terms where successful payment of €400 for a basic room automatically results in a free upgrade to a €2,000 presidential suite, then I formally accept those terms before all witnesses present and am immediately prepared to provide payment, which will trigger the contractual obligation you have just publicly established." His legally precise response transformed what Roberto had intended as humiliating theater into a binding commitment with potentially devastating implications that the arrogant manager had not fully considered in his haste to demonstrate superiority over someone he had prejudged as socially inferior and financially unsuitable. The unusual formality of Miguel's language should have served as a warning that he was not dealing with a confused backpacker but with someone who perfectly understood the legal and commercial dynamics of public offers and contractual acceptance. but Roberto was too committed to his performance of condescending authority to register any red flags that a more careful observer would have immediately noticed. "Of course it's an official offer," Roberto declared with a tone of absolute superiority that he would soon deeply regret. "And I look forward to the processing of your payment, which will reveal the financial reality that your appearance has already clearly communicated to anyone with experience assessing potential clients' financial standing in the luxury hospitality industry." His insistence on continuing with anticipated humiliation despite the opportunity to diplomatically retract his position reflected a toxic combination of arrogance, internalized classism, and overconfidence in his ability to read socioeconomic status based on superficial cues that Spanish society had taught to correlate with actual wealth. Carlos watched the exchange with growing discomfort as he recognized that his manager was escalating the situation in ways that could create significant problems regardless of the outcome of the payment attempt. Even if Miguel's card was declined, as Roberto confidently anticipated, the discriminatory public treatment they had provided violated the professional principles of courteous hospitality that supposedly defined quality service establishments. However, the hotel's clear institutional hierarchy required Carlos to remain silent while his supervisor exercised managerial authority in ways that seemed increasingly professionally imprudent, no matter how justified they might appear based on a superficial assessment of a potential customer's appearance. The growing audience of guests and staff gathered to observe the obviously dramatic confrontation added performative pressure that made it increasingly difficult for Roberto to gracefully retreat from the position he had adopted so publicly and with such patronizing confidence. The moment had acquired a momentum of its own that would sweep participants toward a revelation that would completely transform everyone present's understanding of the relationship between surface appearance and substantive financial reality in ways that would provide memorable lessons about the dangers of biased judgment and classist arrogance. Miguel deliberately reached for the inside pocket of his worn work jacket with a slow movement that prolonged the dramatic anticipation of the moment as he observed the expressions of Roberto and other spectators, who were clearly hoping to witness the embarrassment of a card rejection that would validate the manager's prejudices about the correlation between modest appearance and limited financial resources. "Here's my credit card," he presented with a casual gesture that contrasted dramatically with the significance of the object he was placing on the carved mahogany reception counter, where crystal lamplight reflected off the matte black metal surface and immediately captured Carlos's trained attention. The receptionist instinctively leaned forward to examine the card Miguel had presented more closely, and his facial expression shifted in fractions of a second from neutral expectation to surprised recognition, and then to something akin to horror as he identified the object that had just been casually placed before him. "Sir, this card is—" Carlos began, his voice losing all pretense of professional detachment as his years of training in elite financial instrument identification enabled him to immediately recognize the exclusive American Express Centurion card, issued only to individuals whose personal net worth exceeded several million euros and whose annual spending with American Express exceeded 250,000 euros in verified purchases. The matte black card with no visible numbers, which relied on an integrated chip for processing, was legendary in luxury hospitality circles as the ultimate symbol of extraordinary wealth, far surpassing levels of prosperity represented by platinum or gold cards that ordinary wealthy clients carried with considerable pride. Roberto leaned over Carlos's shoulder to see what had caused such an obviously disturbed reaction in his normally imperturbable receptionist, and his own facial expression underwent a similar transformation from confident condescension to creeping confusion, and finally to a horrifying realization of the magnitude of the error he had just made in prejudging a client's financial standing based solely on modest appearances that evidently did not correlate at all with substantive economic reality. "Please process the payment, Carlos," Miguel instructed, his tone perfectly courteous but now carrying a tinge of authority that hadn't been present or necessary in his previous comments when he was being treated like a destitute backpacker who needed to be diplomatically dissuaded from attempting to stay in an establishment beyond his perceived financial means. The silence that had fallen over the hotel lobby was now absolute except for the sound of Carlos tapping away at a computer as he processed the transaction. hands shaking slightly from nervousness over the implications of what he was discovering in the payment processing system. "The card has been successfully approved for €400, Carlos announced in a barely audible voice as he studied the computer screen with horrified fascination at the additional information the system was revealing about the account holder that clearly exceeded any normal category of wealthy client. And according to the terms Mr. Salazar publicly offered moments ago, the gentleman now qualifies for an automatic upgrade to the presidential suite at no additional charge beyond the initial payment of €400. His reminder of the contractual obligation that Roberto had so confidently created echoed in the stunned silence of the lobby as staff and guests processed the implications of the dramatic reversal they had witnessed between managerial arrogance and financial reality that completely contradicted assumptions they had all shared based on superficial cues of personal appearance. "Wait a moment, please." Roberto desperately attempted to regain control of a situation that had spiraled so far beyond the parameters he had so confidently anticipated just minutes before, his voice betraying mounting panic as he realized that his public performance of condescending authority had created contractual obligations that he could not simply ignore before an audience of witnesses that included both subordinate staff and current guests whose perceptions of the hotel's managerial competence were now being dramatically revised. "My comment about the presidential suite was obviously rhetorical speech rather than a literal contractual offer intended to be taken as binding terms of business, and any reasonable person would have understood that I was using exaggeration to emphasize a point based on perceived probabilities rather than establishing a genuine commercial agreement." His transparent attempt to backtrack on the public commitment he had made so emphatically moments before revealed a fundamental cowardice that contrasted pathetically with the authoritarian bravado he had displayed when he believed he had the upper hand over a vulnerable customer whom he could humiliate without significant consequences to himself or the establishment he represented. Miguel allowed Roberto's rationalization to hang in the air for a moment before responding in a tone that combined superficial reasonableness with clear determination not to allow the arrogant manager to escape the consequences of his own discriminatory behavior. "Mr. Salazar, I have approximately 20 eyewitnesses who heard your specific and detailed offer, including exact terms and precise monetary valuations, which you clearly communicated, leaving no ambiguity about your intent to establish conditional contractual terms," Miguel explained while gesturing to the growing audience of staff and guests who had observed the entire exchange from the beginning to the present moment of reckoning. "And in addition to human witness testimony, I am confident that the hotel's security surveillance system has captured the entire exchange on high-definition video, permanently documenting every word and gesture you employed in describing your proposed terms for my accommodation." His reference to both testimonial and electronic documentation of Roberto's offer effectively closed off any escape route based on claims that comments had been misunderstood or not intended as binding commitments. The mention of security cameras was particularly devastating because Roberto knew the hotel kept exhaustive recordings of all lobby interactions precisely to protect against customer lawsuits or disputes over service quality, meaning that evidence of his biased behavior and subsequent contract offer would be permanently preserved for review by corporate superiors or potentially legal authorities if the situation escalated into the realm of illegal discrimination or breach of contract. Carlos sat frozen behind the reception desk with the expression of someone witnessing a slow-motion car accident, unable to intervene but aware of the professional disaster unfolding before his eyes as his supervisor dug himself progressively deeper into a hole of legal liability and institutional shame. The realization that Miguel was not a confused backpacker but someone with the legal and financial sophistication to enforce contractual obligations added an additional dimension of risk to a situation that had begun as a routine exercise in classist exclusion, but now threatened potentially grave consequences for the hotel and the career of the manager who had so misjudged the customer based on superficial prejudices. The growing horror on Roberto's expression deepened when Carlos leaned in to whisper additional information he had discovered in the payment processing system while verifying a card transaction that had been approved without a hitch despite condescending expectations of an embarrassing rejection. "Mr. Salazar, I believe you should know something more about this client before we continue this conversation." Carlos murmured with an urgency that conveyed the significance of the information he was about to share, though his low tone didn't prevent several nearby guests from hearing enough to understand that an additional revelation was about to occur that would complicate an already extraordinarily awkward situation. Roberto leaned in to listen as his receptionist consulted a computer screen displaying account information associated with the black card Miguel had presented as casually as if it were ordinary plastic that any middle-class consumer might carry for everyday purchases. The name on this account is Miguel Hernandez, and according to customer profile information that American Express shares with luxury hotel partners to provide personalized service, he is the CEO and principal shareholder of Inversions Mediterraneas, Carlos explained, his voice revealing a complete understanding of the devastating implications of this identity for his supervisor, who had spent the last 20 minutes publicly insulting and humiliating a prominent figure in the very industry where they both worked. The revelation hit Roberto like a physical punch as connections formed in his mind about the significance of the name Carlos had just uttered. Inversions Mediterraneas was a hotel conglomerate that owned and operated over 40 luxury properties in Spain and Portugal, with a reputation in the industry for strategic acquisitions of poorly managed properties and transforming them into profitable operations through a combination of capital investment and the implementation of exceptional service standards. Miguel watched the visible processing of information on Roberto's face with an expression that showed not malicious triumph but rather mild professional interest in how the arrogant manager would respond to the realization that he had been treating with public contempt someone whose opinion on hotel operations could have significant consequences for his career and possibly for the future of the Hotel Emperador itself. Perhaps. Miguel finally spoke, breaking the tense silence that had fallen over the lobby as staff and guests processed the implications of the revelation they had heard or inferred from Roberto's and Carlos's reactions. It would be appropriate for us to continue this conversation in a more private setting where we can discuss both my accommodations for this evening and some broader observations I have developed about the service culture and operational practices of this establishment based on my experience since I walked through your elegant doors approximately 25 minutes ago. His suggestion of a private conversation was simultaneously an act of mercy that would avoid further public humiliation for Roberto and a thinly veiled warning that serious discussions about the professional implications of the discriminatory behavior he had demonstrated needed to take place away from an audience of fascinated spectators. Roberto nodded mutely as he gestured toward the staircase leading to the administrative offices on the second floor, his previous arrogance completely evaporated and replaced by the expression of a man who had just realized that he had made a potentially terminal error in a career he had spent 2 decades building through careful management of his professional image and cultivating relationships with elite clientele and corporate superiors. Roberto's private office reflected aspirations for professional success through carefully curated decor, including a framed diploma from a hotel management school, photographs of minor celebrities and local politicians who had stayed at Hotel Emperador, and a collection of industry awards recognizing his service to the luxury hospitality sector during years of seemingly successful management. Miguel surveyed the space as Roberto closed the door with a gesture that seemed to seal him in an interrogation room rather than provide welcome professional privacy for constructive conversation about service standards and operational practices. Mr. Hernandez, please allow me to begin by deeply and sincerely apologizing for the completely inappropriate treatment you experienced in my hotel lobby. Roberto began with a tone of barely contained desperation as he acknowledged that his professional future could depend on how he handled the next few minutes of conversation with someone whose influence in the Spanish hotel industry vastly exceeded his own management position at a single establishment. My behavior was inexcusable and reflected personal biases and classist assumptions that have no place in the professional hospitality that should characterize an establishment of the reputation and caliber of the Hotel Emperador. His admission of guilt was necessary but also strategic as he attempted to minimize professional damage by demonstrating genuine contrition and an understanding of the gravity of his mistakes before Miguel could fully articulate his assessment of the situation and the potential consequences for the hotel and its management staff. Miguel sat in the leather chair across from Roberto's desk and took a moment to carefully consider how to frame a response that would balance appropriate fairness with recognition of the complex human and business realities informing the situation he had observed in the lobby during his unannounced evaluation of a property he had been considering for possible corporate takeover. "Mr. Salazar, I appreciate your apology and acknowledgement that your behavior was troubling," Miguel responded, his tone firm but not vindictive as he considered both the personal dimension of the humiliation he had experienced and the broader institutional implications of the discriminatory treatment, which evidently represented cultural patterns within the hotel rather than an isolated individual aberration. "But my concern extends beyond how I personally was treated to more fundamental questions about the values and practices that inform the operations of this property under your management." His redirection of the conversation from the specific incident to systemic issues signaled that he was not simply seeking a personal apology but rather assessing Roberto's suitability to continue in a position of authority over an establishment that purported to represent standards of excellence in hospitality but had clearly developed a service culture that prioritized superficial exclusivity over genuine professional courtesy toward all customers regardless of their outward appearance or perceived socio-economic status. "The fundamental problem I observed was not simply that you misjudged me based on my attire," Miguel continued while maintaining direct eye contact with Roberto, who was visibly squirming in his leather executive chair, "but that your entire approach to hotel management seems built on the premise that quality service should be selectively distributed based on subjective assessments of who deserves professional courtesy based on superficial cues of wealth and social class that you have learned to interpret during your career in an industry that frequently confuses artificial exclusivity with genuine service excellence." His analysis articulated a fundamental philosophical critique of the operating model Roberto had implemented and defended as appropriate for a truly luxury establishment that needed to protect its brand from dilution through association with inappropriate clientele. Miguel's formulation connected Roberto's individual behavior to broader structural problems in the luxury hospitality industry, which marketed class discrimination as a desirable characteristic rather than recognizing it as an ethical and professional failing that contradicted fundamental service principles that supposedly defined hotel excellence regardless of price level or property exclusivity. "I came to Hotel Emperador today specifically to evaluate whether this property would be an appropriate addition to Mediterranean Investments' portfolio." Miguel revealed information that completely transformed the context of his presence at the hotel from a personal whim to a strategic business evaluation with potentially significant implications for the future of the property and all its employees. "And I deliberately dressed modestly to observe how the staff would treat guests who presented no obvious signs of wealth or status, because I believe the true measure of a hotel's service culture is revealed in how it treats those who lack the obvious power to reward good service or punish bad treatment through complaints to upper management or negative public reviews." His explanation of methodology provided rational context for what might otherwise appear to be eccentric billionaire behavior playing psychological games with service staff for personal amusement, rather than serious professional evaluation of hotel operations using research techniques that provided insights into actual institutional practices versus official policies that existed only in training manuals and public relations statements. Roberto listened with a look of mounting horror as he realized that his discriminatory treatment of Miguel had not simply been an embarrassing interpersonal error but a catastrophic professional failure that had been observed and documented by exactly the kind of expert evaluator whose judgment could determine the hotel's economic future and the continued viability of his own managerial career in an industry where reputations were built slowly over decades but could be destroyed instantly by viral incidents or negative evaluations from influential figures. The irony that his efforts to protect the hotel's exclusivity by rejecting seemingly inappropriate customers had resulted in the alienation of precisely the kind of sophisticated investor whose approval was critical to long-term commercial success was not lost on Roberto as he processed the full dimensions of his error in judgment. "May I ask what your assessment is after what you experienced today?" Roberto finally asked, his voice losing all pretense of executive authority and reflecting the vulnerability of an employee whose future depended entirely on the judgment of someone empowered to determine not only his individual fate but also the trajectory of the entire establishment where he had invested 2 decades of professional work. Miguel considered the question carefully while weighing competing responsibilities toward personal justice for the discriminatory treatment he had experienced, the well-being of innocent hotel employees who had not participated in Roberto's biases, the commercial interests of Mediterranean investments, which required decisions based on an objective analysis of investment potential rather than emotional revenge for personal insults, and the broader societal goals of reforming discriminatory practices in the hotel industry through appropriate consequences that would set precedents for acceptable behavior. The physical facilities of this hotel are exceptional, and the location is strategically valuable for our portfolio of properties in Madrid. Miguel responded with an assessment that separated architectural and commercial merits from the deficiencies in human resource management and service culture he had observed during his visit. So I will proceed with the acquisition of the Hotel Emperador because the fundamental value of the asset justifies the necessary investment to remedy the operational and cultural problems that your leadership has allowed to develop during your tenure as general manager. His decision to proceed with the purchase provided a measure of security for hotel employees while making it abundantly clear that significant changes in management practices would be implemented under new ownership that would not tolerate institutionalized discrimination as acceptable operational policy. Regarding your personal position within the restructured organization, Miguel continued as Roberto awaited a verdict on his professional future with a doomed expression awaiting a court ruling. I cannot in good conscience allow you to continue in your role as general manager where your demonstrated prejudices regarding class and human worth would continue to inform decisions about personnel, service policies, and the treatment of guests who do not meet your arbitrary standards of appropriate appearance or personal presentation. Roberto's removal from his position of managerial authority was inevitable given the severity of his discriminatory behavior and the implications of allowing him to remain in a role where he could perpetuate an institutional culture of classist exclusion that contradicted Inversions Mediterranea's core values of universal professional service. However, Miguel added after a pause that allowed Roberto to absorb the reality that he would lose the prestigious position that had defined his professional identity for years. I recognize that you possess valuable operational experience in luxury hotel management that could be useful in a different capacity if you demonstrate the ability and willingness to critically examine your assumptions about the relationship between personal appearance and human worth or financial capability. His offer of possible continued employment in a restructured role reflected a pragmatic belief that people could learn from mistakes through appropriate consequences combined with education and professional development focused on addressing problematic attitudes that had informed discriminatory behavior. You will be transferred to an operational training position where your technical knowledge of hotel management can contribute value, while your direct contact with guests will be eliminated until you complete a comprehensive professional development program focused on recognizing and eliminating classist biases that inform judgments about human dignity and the right to courteous service. Miguel explained specific terms of reassignment that would provide both punishment proportional to the offense and opportunity for personal growth and professional rehabilitation if Roberto demonstrated a genuine commitment to change. The training program Miguel described would include supervised work at Mediterranean investments properties that served clientele from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds, educational exposure to research on implicit bias and discrimination in service industries, and ongoing evaluation of progress in developing more inclusive attitudes about who deserved professional respect regardless of superficial cues of status or wealth. The months following Inversions Mediterranea's acquisition of Hotel Emperador brought profound changes in both the property's physical operations and the institutional culture that defined how staff interacted with guests of diverse backgrounds and personal appearances who previously might have been subtly discouraged from seeking accommodations at properties that marketed exclusivity as a primary feature. Carmen Vega assumed the position of interim general manager with a specific mandate to implement Inversion's Mediterranean service standards that emphasized universal professional courtesy toward all guests regardless of personal appearance, spending level, or perceived cues of socioeconomic status that staff had previously learned to interpret as indicators of differential appropriate treatment. Our fundamental objective is to redefine luxury hospitality from exclusivity based on exclusion to excellence based on consistent, professional service that recognizes the inherent dignity of every guest, Carmen explained during the first full staff meeting, where she articulated the operational philosophy that would guide the property's transformation. Because our company's research and experience demonstrate that true excellence in hospitality emerges from an organizational culture that values genuine respect over artificial hierarchies that create uncomfortable environments for both guests and staff who must navigate arbitrary systems of social categorization. Her presentation of the new vision directly challenged assumptions that many employees had internalized during years of working under management that treated selective discrimination as an appropriate tool to maintain a luxurious environment that justified premium prices. The mandatory training program that all employees completed during their first weeks under new management included modules on recognizing implicit biases, the impact of discrimination on guest experiences and employee well-being, and specific techniques for providing exceptional service without relying on judgments about the relative value of guests based on superficial characteristics or advanced spending. Some of you may question whether equal treatment of all guests will dilute the perception of exclusivity that attracts high-net-worth guests. Acknowledged training facilitator Patricia Ruiz during an interactive session addressing predictable resistance to changes in established practices. But data from our other properties consistently demonstrates that affluent clients value genuine professional service and a respectful environment more than artificial hierarchies that require humiliating others to validate their own status, and that hotels that eliminate selective discrimination experience both improved guest satisfaction and reduced staff turnover that result in superior financial performance. Her anticipatory response to objections included quantitative evidence that validated the inclusive service business model while challenging unexamined assumptions about what luxury clientele truly valued in hotel experiences. The physical renovations that accompanied the cultural changes included the removal of signage and spatial layout that had created obvious hierarchies between hotel areas, the upgrade of a basement room that Roberto had contemptuously offered to Miguel to meet the exact same quality standards as premium accommodations on upper floors, and the implementation of a guest feedback system that specifically monitored service experiences rather than just satisfaction with physical amenities. The significant capital investment these improvements required reflected Inversion's Mediterranean's commitment to creating an environment where luxury was defined by consistent quality and professional service rather than the artificial exclusion of guests deemed socially inappropriate based on the arbitrary standards of management. The message we want to communicate through these changes, Miguel explained during a launch event introducing the renovated Hotel Emperador to media and industry leaders, is that true luxury hospitality honors each guest as an individual deserving of respect and exceptional service, because human dignity is not a privilege earned through visible wealth but a fundamental right that service professionals should universally recognize regardless of personal circumstances or external presentation of guests. His articulation of operational philosophy provided an ethical framework that elevated the conversation about hotel standards beyond purely commercial considerations toward principles of social responsibility for service industries in societies that professed democratic and egalitarian values. Roberto's trajectory during his intensive training and professional reassignment provided a case study of the possibilities and challenges of changing attitudes among adults whose professional identities and understandings of the world had been shaped by decades of immersion in an industrial culture that normalized class discrimination as acceptable and even desirable. The first few weeks at the three-star hotel were profoundly uncomfortable, Roberto admitted during a feedback session with his training supervisor, because they forced me to confront how deeply I had internalized ideas about the inherent superiority of serving wealthy clientele versus those of moderate-budget travelers, whose value as human beings I had unconsciously equated with the amount they spent on accommodations. His recognition of internalized biases represented a necessary first step toward genuine change, although he acknowledged that modifying thought patterns ingrained over 20 years would require sustained effort and honest self-examination that would be uncomfortable and challenging to his previous understanding of professional identity and success. The daily work of serving clients his previous self would have dismissed as unsuitable for serious attention provided an experiential education that no amount of theoretical instruction could replicate. About a shared humanity that transcended economic differences and about the genuine satisfaction that emerged from helping people solve practical needs regardless of their ability to pay or personal appearance. I met a family who had been saving for 2 years to afford a modest vacation in Madrid, Roberto shared during a reflection that revealed shifts in his perspective. And the gratitude they expressed for courteous attention and help with itinerary planning made me realize that a significant impact on human experiences doesn't require serving exclusively the ultra-wealthy but emerges from a genuine commitment to making every interaction positive regardless of economic context. His growing appreciation for the intrinsic value of well-provided service marked an evolution from a transactional understanding of hospitality as a commercial exchange to a more humanistic understanding of the industry as a facilitator of meaningful human experiences that enriched lives in ways that transcended purely financial considerations. Periodic evaluations of his progress documented a gradual transformation of attitudes that allowed for eventual consideration for a return to a management position at one of Inversions Mediterranea's smaller properties, where he could apply operational expertise while demonstrating a sustained commitment to inclusive service that did not discriminate based on appearance or perceived class. His personal experience with the consequences of prejudice and the process of attitude change provides him with a unique perspective that can be valuable in training other managers, Patricia Ruiz observed during the final evaluation of Roberto's professional development program. Because he can speak authentically about how classist biases inform management decisions in ways that employees may not consciously recognize until they are challenged to examine assumptions that the industry has taught them to accept as self-evident truths about the nature of luxury service. His professional rehabilitation became a component of a broader training program that Inversions Mediterranea's implemented across all its properties to address systemic discrimination in the hospitality industry through a combination of education, appropriate consequences for unacceptable behavior, and opportunities for redemption for those who demonstrated a genuine commitment to personal and professional change. The transformative impact of Hotel Emperador extended beyond individual properties to broader conversations within the Spanish hospitality industry about the relationship between exclusivity, service quality, and discriminatory practices that many luxury establishments had normalized as necessary components of a premium brand that justified prices beyond the financial capabilities of most consumers. The Hotel Emperador case has become a prominent study in hotel management programs, reported a hospitality professor during an industry conference, because it provides a concrete example of how an establishment can maintain standards of excellence and luxury market positioning while eliminating discriminatory practices previously assumed to be essential to protecting brand exclusivity. Their academic analysis validated the inclusive service business model while providing empirical evidence that challenged traditional assumptions about operational requirements for successful high-end hospitals. The performance data that Hotel Emperador generated during its first year under management by Inversions Mediterranea's demonstrated significant improvements across multiple metrics, including occupancy rates that increased 23%, guest satisfaction scores that improved across all feedback categories, and a dramatic reduction in staff turnover that reflected an improved work environment where employees no longer needed to navigate cumbersome differential service systems based on subjective judgments about the relative worth of guests. Most notable, Carmen Vega reported during the annual results presentation, is that we have seen a particular increase in high-net-worth clientele who specifically choose our hotel because they appreciate a service culture that treats everyone with dignity rather than creating artificial hierarchies that require performative deference based on external signals of wealth and social status. Her observation about the preferences of wealthy consumers directly challenged traditional narratives that equate luxury with exclusion, suggesting that many prosperous individuals valued environments that reflected egalitarian principles over experiences that validated superiority through comparison with others less fortunate. Industry recognition came when professional associations awarded Inversions Mediterraneas and Hotel Emperador specifically for innovation in inclusive service that demonstrated the commercial viability of a hospitality industry that prioritized universal dignity over class-based hierarchies, validating an approach that initial critics had dismissed as naive idealism incompatible with the economic realities of the luxury market. Articles in trade publications and presentations at industry conferences amplified the model's influence beyond individual properties to broader professional standards that began to question long-held assumptions about practices necessary for success in the high-end hospitality segment. The cultural transformation Miguel catalyzed through his personal experience of discrimination and his strategic response through acquisition and operational reform demonstrated how individual incidents of injustice could become catalysts for institutional change when resourceful and determined leaders chose to address systemic problems rather than simply seeking personal vindication or redress for the inappropriate treatment they had experienced. The story of the confrontation at Hotel Emperador between Miguel Hernandez and Roberto Salazar spread widely across social and traditional media, capturing the public imagination because it articulated universal tensions about class, dignity, and assumptions about human worth that resonated far beyond the specific hotel industry to the shared experiences of appearance-based discrimination that millions of people had faced in diverse service contexts. The video of the exchange has been viewed more than 50 million times, reported a digital media analyst, because it satisfies the vicarious desire to see arrogance and prejudice confronted in ways that most victims of discrimination never have the resources or position to effectively accomplish. Their analysis of viral appeal identified narrative elements that made the story particularly resonant: a dramatic reversal of power dynamics, the humiliation of an authority figure who had abused his position, and validation of the principle that superficial appearances should not determine the treatment or respect individuals receive in business and social interactions. The divided comments between those celebrating Roberto's public humiliation and those arguing that the loss of his managerial position constituted excessively harsh punishment for a single mistake reflected broader societal tensions over appropriate accountability for discrimination, possibilities for redemption after prejudiced behavior, and the balance between individual justice and consequences that could destroy careers and lives in ways disproportionate to specific offenses. Roberto Salazar made a terrible mistake that deserved consequences, the labor advocate acknowledged during public debate, but the response must balance accountability with recognition that discriminatory attitudes often reflect broader cultural and industry norms that individuals have internalized rather than independently invented, suggesting that education and opportunity for change may be more appropriate than permanent destruction of career prospects. His argument for proportionality generated constructive debate about how societies should respond to discrimination in ways that discourage unacceptable behavior without eliminating possibilities for personal growth and rehabilitation for those willing to critically examine prejudices that had guided previous actions. Interviews with Miguel about his business philosophy and motivations for his particular response to the discrimination he experienced provided additional perspective that moved the conversation beyond the satisfaction of revenge toward a consideration of how resourceful leaders could use personal experiences of injustice to catalyze institutional changes that benefited broader communities rather than simply seeking individual vindication or redress. My goal was never to destroy Roberto Salazar's career, but rather to use the incident as an opportunity to address discriminatory culture that he represented but did not single-handedly create, Miguel explained during a reflective interview. Because systemic problems require systemic responses that go beyond individual punishment to transforming norms and practices that allow prejudicial behavior to flourish as accepted practice in industries where it should be recognized as a fundamental professional failing. His articulation of his goals provided a framework for understanding how his response balanced multiple considerations of personal justice, institutional reform, the well-being of innocent employees, and setting precedents that could influence broader practices in the hospitality industry and related service sectors facing similar challenges with normalized discrimination. The continued expansion of Inversions Mediterraneas through the acquisition of additional properties, where Miguel personally assessed service cultures through incognito visits, became a signature business practice that garnered positive attention from consumers who valued a corporate commitment to equitable service while generating understandable apprehension among hotel managers who recognized that their assumptions about appropriate clientele could be tested at any time by evaluators who did not conform to superficial expectations about the appearance of wealthy individuals. We have identified and acquired 18 additional properties since the Emperador incident, Miguel reported during the investor presentation. And in each case we have implemented exhaustive training programs in inclusive service that have resulted in measurable improvements in both guest satisfaction and financial performance, validating a hospitality business model that prioritizes universal dignity over artificial exclusivity. The quantitative results provided a robust economic justification for an ethical approach that initial skeptics had questioned as potentially unsustainable in a competitive marketplace where differentiation through exclusivity had been a dominant strategy in the luxury segment for decades. Inversions Mediterraneas's property portfolio grew into a network of establishments recognized for exceptional service that did not rely on the exclusion of diverse clientele, attracting both guests who appreciated a respectful environment and talented employees who valued working in organizations where they were not expected to engage in selective discrimination as part of their professional responsibilities. Academic partnerships developed with hospitality management schools incorporated the Hotel Emperador case and Inversions Mediterranea's broader operational model into curricula on corporate social responsibility, ethical leadership, and diversity management in service industries. The Hernandez-Salazar case provides an extraordinarily rich example for analyzing the intersection of business ethics and business strategy, observed the dean of the hospitality school. Because it demonstrates that doing the morally right thing can align with superior business outcomes when leadership has the vision and commitment to challenging industry assumptions about practices necessary for success in premium market segments. Its academic evaluation provided intellectual legitimacy for a model that would influence the training of future generations of hospitality professionals who would enter the industry with a different understanding of the relationship between service excellence and inclusive practices. The influence of Miguel's approach gradually spread beyond the hotel industry to other luxury service sectors, where similar appearance-based discrimination had been normalized as an appropriate mechanism for protecting brand exclusivity or maintaining commercial environments that specifically appealed to wealthy customers willing to pay premium prices by association with spaces where the presence of lower social classes was discreetly minimized through selective gatekeeping practices. Consumer rights movements began referencing standards established by Mediterranean investments when arguing for stronger anti-discrimination regulations in service industries, while civil rights organizations cited the transformation of Hotel Emperador as evidence that significant institutional change was possible when corporate leaders chose to prioritize equity over convenience or conformity to problematic industry norms. The legacy of the humiliating encounter Roberto had so confidently initiated in the lobby of the Hotel Emperador extended far beyond the immediate circumstances into a broader cultural conversation about the dignity, respect, and obligations that service companies have toward all customers regardless of their ability to pay or outward appearance in democratic societies that profess a commitment to the fundamental equality of citizens before both public and private institutions that provide essential or discretionary services.